Welcome to the Bidwells seminar this afternoon. There is over 300 of you out there listening to us today. And we're looking at today the political pressure and public pressure that is driving sustainability and affecting the demands of property, and also the impact that COVID-19 will have on how we view sustainability in the future. Today on the call we have several people to help us in this debate. We have Sven Töpel, CEO of Brookgate, Sam Hyde, Managing Director of TTP based in Melbourne and Cambridgeshire, Mike Derbyshire, Head of our Planning team, Sue Foxley, our Research Director, and Max Bryan, Head of our Laboratory and Office Agency. And obviously I'm Nick Pettit, I head up the Project Management Division within Bidwells. The session today will be briefly undertaken in a moment by Sue, giving us some research data. Mike will then give us some further insight into how sustainability is changing the planning arena. And then we'll go into some question and answers with regard to our panel members to understand the impact upon their business. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Sue, who will give us some insight into some initial research that's been undertaken. Sue.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks. And I am going to share some slides with you. So hopefully just give me 1 second. I suppose I should hold my hand up first of all and just say I studied environmental studies about 30 years ago, and so it's kind of been a bit of a long haul for me on this whole issue. And I suppose up until about 4 months ago, everything was looking very positive. So as we enter still a very, very uncertain time, not only for the economy but for a whole range of issues in society, it's a good point to sort of just have a sort of stock check of where we are and where we may be going. So I suppose the fact is that even though the sustainability agenda might not be in our immediate consciousness at the moment, the urgency has not disappeared. We haven't really been given a mortgage holiday, the equivalent of, and the tipping points are all still there. So it's just as important as it was, as is the target towards net zero. So while we're in the early days of lockdown, and that gave us a reduction in pollution, really there's been a sort of uncommon quiet, and people have been focused on other things. But I suppose one point to raise is the fact that COVID-19 pause, as The Economist put it last week, I think it was, it's not inherently climate friendly. It's countries that make it so. So there is action that's needed. So while we're in the very early days of this long journey, it's really will be a continuation of change over various aspects of our lives. And there really aren't any forecasts on what the future holds. There's a lot of thinking going on, lots of views, etc. But what I'm going to do is really just pick out some of the things that are coming out, and really where some of that thinking is going, from academia, from global organisations, and then a few random others in there as well. So, you know, really, I suppose the point is that we're in a very uncertain period, and what happens during those periods can be good and bad, but undoubtedly change occurs during that period. And, you know, whether it's we started cycling or we've started to drive more, there is change occurring. So one of my first themes in terms of what has changed and what is coming to the fore at the moment is technological solutions. A practical outcome really is that we've seen the customary face-to-face stuff that we're doing at the moment is more virtual, and we've become used to it. We've had to, it's delivering education and a whole range of Zoom sort of lock-in sessions. But what we know from China is that extended periods of quarantine tends to change behaviour, and it adapts and helps us adapt to that. And the longer it goes on, the more ingrained it becomes. So it's quite difficult to then reverse completely those things. I suppose the point is we won't necessarily go back to normal, whatever that was. There are also plenty of surveys out there, you would have seen multiple versions of these on home working. This is just one, a recent YouGov ICM survey, showing that there's a general sense that there will be a more permanent change to a higher level of home working. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is going to be working at home and that's the end of the offices, but it does change to a large extent what happens in those offices, and that's something I'm sure we'll pick up on a little bit later. I think the other point I wanted to raise is really around the tech side, and actually tech science really has come to the fore. We see it every day in our the Downing Street briefings, and it raises expectations in terms of what's achievable there. And whether there will, once we get through this, there'll be expectations that tech can also save the climate crisis as well. There are a lot of arguments why that is not necessarily a good thing in terms of changing behaviour, but it's one of those things that's likely to come out of there. But there are undoubtedly issues that's going to come out of this radical use of tech that has been forced upon us. So my second theme is transparency, and a greater level of transparency that's come through over just in a very, very short period of time. This is not really an economic point per se, but there are implications of it. We've got our daily Downing Street briefing, messages from our business leaders, and to detailed statistics on metrics that we hadn't even heard of before a few months ago. So at some point, of course, the number 10 briefing is going to stop, surely. But it's very difficult to reverse transparency. We all now expect it. We expect that information. And that in turn, once we pass through COVID, will turn to other aspects of our lives and business behaviour. And that could be our buildings and how they operate, work practices, and everything is going to undergo greater scrutiny than it did in the past. My third theme is an acceleration in collaboration. There's a certain irony in this, in that exactly at the point where people can't get together, we've seen a tremendous level of collaboration between public sector, private sector, and all those in between. And that's brought about some amazing achievements, whether it's on the ventilator side or multiple other aspects. If anyone listened to the Today programme this morning, Bill Gates talking about the relationships between the pharmaceutical companies and governments and everybody else. So amazing achievements being made there. And because of financial reasons, and just because those relationships have been developed, it's unlikely that collaboration is going to stop. And we'll have the government as a key operator in the economy, possibly investor in terms of companies as well. So they have an influence on the direction as well. And so this is likely to generate new ways of working as well. We've clearly proven that we can be innovative. We don't have to be in the same space, but what we do know is that is those casual connections and that casual meeting, whether it's sort of just outside getting the sandwich or whatever, that actually creates a lot of innovative opportunities. And so our spaces and our places in towns and on the science parks and within buildings, all of those places are going to need to adapt and provide the facilities and abilities with the technology in order to maintain innovation. Fourth point, competing economic pressures. So we're at the point now where there are lots of decisions are going to have to be made, as this quote from the New Scientist notes. And on the one hand, we saw the massive queues from IKEA, which I can't, it just is staggering in terms of the draw for the shop in the first days of its opening. And on the other hand, we've also got lower interest rates, and we're set for a stimulus package. So there are real conflicts there in terms of let's get back to normal from an economic point of view. And then also the other side of that is what is that new normal and what will that deliver? There are some EU countries that are really starting to argue that the EU Green Deal should be watered down. And while there are plenty of others now who are saying that really we should be focusing on infrastructure and technology and training, which at the moment that's where the Chancellor seems to be approaching things. So it's not clear yet whether that will support the 2050 target on zero emissions. However, there are also some positive signs in this. what we've seen during the COVID crisis, the European Commission has produced a consultation on their renewed sustainable finance strategy, which really makes a very clear link between COVID and actually how we are functioning as a global economy and seeking to address that. We've seen deals come through and funding opportunities come through and things like battery technology. And this is just one example from it's the Nevada Tesla factories. There are a number of opportunities out there that are coming through from an economic point of view, and it is decision time in terms of how we're going to structure the economy and the opportunities we're going to take forward. My fifth and final point is an open door. So before this crisis, there was obviously intense pressure from a sustainability point of view, in terms of the not only the marches and the public involvement, but also actually increasing uncomfortableness with how capitalism is operating, and a lot of calls that how a different focus and a different kind of approach to the future. What we've seen since is that actually, while some professional investors are actually saying they'll prioritise their business over environmental and social governance, in theory, actually, generally the sense is long term that those things are more important than dividends. That's a survey from Boston Consulting Group. And the fact is that ESG funds have actually outperformed during this crisis, and much of this is very much due to governance, that consideration that they are well-governed companies, and that's who you want to invest in at this time, that they look after their people and they look after the environment. And there is this increasing debate around stakeholder capitalism, and that can only increase. And the government has, of course, the ability now to actually tie any of its support, which it's going to be providing over the coming months, to net zero objectives. So there's an awful lot of factors there that really can push what was an open door to start with. So I'd argue it's not, in terms of the financial crisis in 2008, what came out the other end of that was actually life went back to normal pretty much. We saw a drop in pollution, and then life went back to normal. Life is a little bit different now. But let's look at that and just think, how do we as individuals feel about it? Are people more concerned about their own physical and economic well-being just at the moment, and does that mean that the government will be inclined to take its foot off the accelerator a little bit in terms of approaching sustainability goals? Well, this slide here perhaps suggests that might be the case. However, what's interesting is these are searches on global warming, and if we can see a clear drop-off, albeit with another little peak, following the lockdown. If we then look at solar energy searches, we can see that that's increased dramatically. And I suppose what I take from this is that perhaps the crisis has taken immediate attention off the big environmental issues as people focus on their own survival in all senses of the word, but perhaps now more focused on how it affects them personally, and perhaps a selfish motivation is potentially at least as powerful to exert the need for change going forward. The government certainly has a potential role to nudge further with incentives and penalties to sustain COVID-driven changes in behaviour, and a lot of those will be focused on health and well-being. So I suppose all in all, just to finish up, it's feasible that the sustainability agenda could see a step change in momentum rather than a deferment post-COVID. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. Could we then, Mike, move on to yourself now to give an overview of how sustainability and planning policies are coming together?
Yeah, I think Matt's asked me to introduce the fact that just before the Q&A session, we will just run a little poll. I'll ask a number of questions. If I could ask you to put your views down once you've heard the presentations and the panel, it's quite a fun little exercise. Nick, you've asked me a question. Will planning keep up with what's going on? Not a cat in hell's chance. So there's no way that planning policy, as we know, it will keep pace with the changes that are going on. So what I've done is I've looked, and I'll spend just 5 minutes, I've looked at the narrative on sustainability versus economic planning versus general planning over the last 4 months. And we need to take ourselves back to 2019, which was probably the most seminal year in planning in my 32-year career. We've got a climate, we've got a climate emergency, and all policy in 2019 was focused around that sole goal. We had the Environment Bill at the end of the year, that actually came in January. We had the Extinction Rebellion on the lawns of one of our clients. We had Greta Thunberg. So we had one crisis. We've morphed into another crisis. But Matt, if you could show the slide, which is a recent poll that the BBC held, I think it's quite useful if I just show up this slide before I go into the narrative that I've got. So COVID is immediate and it's in our minds at the moment in time, but the climate change agenda has not disappeared. Most people in most countries, other than our friends in the US, think that it is equally as serious as COVID-19. So all the emphasis and all the importance of 2019 hasn't evaporated in a lot of people's minds. So my narrative is, what was 2019, the seminal year, then the period leading up to the COVID incident, so January to March, sentiment in April, and the sentiment that we've got currently at this moment in time. What's quite clear to me is that the response from the government is very different to the 2008 response in terms of planning policy. What we've had is a focus on short-term freeing up of the planning system. So we have virtual planning committees. We now are no longer obliged to send out notices, so we have digital engagement. What we don't have, which we had at the end of 2000, just at the beginning of the 2008 crisis, is those pretty substantial reductions in what I would call burdens on developers. So Section 106 viability obligations. We had a slew of legislation and policy that came out. I'm slightly older. I remember the late 1980s, and Nicholas Ridley and the Conservative government, the Margaret Thatcher's approach to the economic crisis that we had at the time, that was develop at all costs. There was presumption in favour of development. There was no caveats to that, and people that operated in the late 80s, early 90s knew how difficult, I was in local government at the time, it was to stop any development coming forward. That is not the sentiment that's coming out now. All the sentiment that's coming out at the moment, and I echo Sue here, is there is £5 trillion worth of investment. That was the Davos World Summit in January, and then the G20 summit in March. Every discussion is being phrased around the COVID reset. The COVID reset is around a green agenda. Dealing with the local authorities on a daily basis, it is quite clear that they are being pragmatic in a load of things they do. But one of the things they won't be pragmatic on is the sustainability agenda. And what's coming out very clearly now is that this is a huge amount of public money. And if this public money is funding and backing business, there is going to be some payback. And the payback that is being discussed is very much that it's a green payback. So the policies that we're seeing and the discussions that we're having are around, yeah, let's see if we can encourage it. Let's see how we can bring these things forward quickly. One discussion that I'm not hearing any echoes of in any corridors of power and local authorities, there is a suggestion, as we had in the 1980s, as we definitely had at the end of the 2000s, 2008, 2009, 2010, it's build at any cost. So the advice that I'm giving to clients here is saying, what weight should we attach to COVID-19 in our approach moving forward? There's lots of benefits economically that will be there, but they will not be at the expense of policy. And we only have to look at the letter that was sent to the Telegraph on Monday by 200 businesses demanding that the COVID recovery is based on a green recovery, because investment in green technology generates cleaner jobs, it generates better jobs, and it generates better paid jobs. And particularly in the arc, when you go along from Oxford, Cambridge, Milton Keynes, and Norwich, they're all Labour-based authorities, all Labour-led authorities. That agenda will resonate with them. So in terms of planning policy, we haven't seen any turn in planning policy at all. And my thoughts are that the infrastructure that Sue talked about, the investment that Sue talked about, will be heavily laden and backed. by payback, and that payback is going to be a green agenda. So I see a huge positive collateral in the green agenda in planning, and I think planning policy will catch up. As always with planning policy, it's never that quick to catch up, but planning policy will catch up, and that will be, has been, and will continue to be central to economic development as well. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Mike. That's very useful. I think what we'll do now is that we'll just carry out the introductions in a little bit more detail for Sven and Sam. So perhaps if Sven, you could introduce yourself first of all, please.
Hello, my name is Sven Töpel. I'm the Chief Executive of Brookgate, which is a Cambridge-based development mixed-use developer doing offices and hotel and student, some residential. You know, given we work across all those sectors, we have a very large number of stakeholders. Most of our land is government owned. We have funders and tenants and politicians, the local community, and the dialogue that we've been having, you know, whilst we've been sitting at home is absolutely, as Mike was saying, is the agenda is relentlessly towards a more sustainable future. Yes, COVID is having an impact and is changing how we do some things. I'll give you some idea of how COVID is, you know, affecting us directly. We're talking to a number of pre-lets, and you know, in this COVID crisis, they turn around to us, and some of them are conflicting. But you know, firstly, can we have opening windows? That's quite sustainable. Can we make the building more resilient? Can we have more air changes? That's less sustainable. Can we improve the air quality? Can we have filters? Can we use greater technology so we don't have to touch doors, no touch lifts, no touch WCs? So I think it is engendering, within that sustainability framework, change, and it's driving through change. Not all of these things will become the norm, but a lot of them will become the norm. Some of the other things that all of our stakeholders are talking about is sustainable transport. It's about, you know, it's about the shower facilities, it's about the gyms, it's about the whole wellness agenda. Cycling and walking post-COVID will be really important. And one of the things that we as a society and our stakeholders, you know, in that world where you're encouraging people to get on their bike, in Norman Tebbit speak, is the focus on air quality. And politically, I think, you know, what we're hearing back is that there is a bit more political will to try and resolve air quality. It's been quite difficult, you know, in terms of trying to deal with the air quality agenda, but I'm hoping in a COVID world, increased sustainability, more sustainable transport, that air quality will be properly on the agenda. And I think, just picking up on Sue's point, you know, ultimately the customers for us are our tenants and our funders, and they are driving us very hard on ESG. You know, we are the deliverer of the product, but ultimately we are not the end customer, and the end customer are the people that occupy the buildings and pay the rent, and that own the buildings. So I don't see any let up in this sustainability agenda, and if anything, during this COVID period, it's accelerating.
Thanks, Sven. Perhaps I could drop on to Sam now. Who could you introduce yourself, Sam?
Thanks, Nick. Yes, my name is Sam Hyde. I'm Managing Director of TTP, the Technology Partnership. We're a technology and product development company, employee-owned, 350 scientists and engineers based just south of Cambridge. We're about inventing new products, new technologies that are disruptive into markets. I think the COVID crisis has been a good example of what we do. We invented and developed and proved a ventilator in 10 days and then enabled Dyson to manufacture it. One of our diagnostic devices is being used as a point of care test for people who've got the virus. That's with a company called DNA Nudge. And one of our technologies is being used to make antibody tests, which have been CE marked and are being distributed in the UK. But we do work across a broad range of industries, across the life sciences and healthcare, but also in areas like satellite communications and industrial. We are an owner-occupier, so we're based all on this one site in Melbourne, just south of Cambridge, a small science park. Our locations are pretty critical to us as an inventive business. We try to foster the right kind of culture. I think, as Sue referenced, this idea of more virtual work is a key question for us, because I think there's a great difference between the kind of scheduled work that people can do from home in a more organised and separable way, to the less scheduled, the more opportunistic work, which is critical in the inventive industries. So as a business, we've been, as well as owning our current park, we've been planning a new headquarters for the past 2 years on a greenfield site just next door to the current park. And obviously sustainability was an important factor in that for us, as was the effectiveness of the building, and how our staff wanted that and reacted to that. And I think, as Sven pointed out, perhaps the most critical issue was transport. On the COVID-19 impact, currently we're managing to maintain the use of the labs with a low occupancy, so businesses actually continuing quite well. We probably only have 10 to 20% of staff in the facility at the moment, but we're a one-site company, and we do normally thrive on that informal interaction and opportunity to discussions. So the whole move to home working is a major challenge to what we do. Like Sven, I don't see the sustainability argument going away. I think COVID-19 will be managed, and there's a short-term blip on people's opinion, and whether buildings meet the COVID demand is less important to the sustainable question.
Thanks, Sam. I think, Matt, you're going to launch the first question in our poll that will be taking place as we have the whole of the session this afternoon. So if people have the opportunity to respond to that one. I'd like to probably now, Matt, if we could bring everybody back into the equation, so that we can start to have a bit more of a meaningful debate on some of the questions that we would like to pose to our different panelists. And I think that the questions really are to try and establish what criteria people are putting on sustainability from their personal point of view and from a business point of view, because I think there is an odd juxtaposition between those two. I think politicians are looking for the property world to perhaps drive the sustainability agenda, and also the economic return where possible. And I think that there are a few other elements that many of us perhaps don't quite consider all the time, which relates to embodied energy and perhaps life cycle costings, which we see less of at the moment in our assessment of sustainability when looking at projects overall. So perhaps could I return to Sam first of all? Sam, you've mentioned that you're looking at developing a new building for which we're working with you on it. 300 people, single-story building. It'd be interesting to understand how and what your staff have said to you as an owner-occupier on the sustainability criteria, and whether or not you have seen them specifically influencing your thinking around this, or is it much more around the directors of the business that are actually influencing that? Where are the touch points coming from for you?
Sure. Undoubtedly, staff are impacting our decisions on the new building. I think sustainability is a priority for younger staff, and that's most critical to us is recruitment. So the battle around recruitment, particularly in the Cambridge area, is fierce. The younger generation actually assume that sustainability is at the heart of your business. It's not questioned when you interview, when you recruit people. And if they discover that it's not a priority, actually they are rather disheartened. They are driving a pace of discussion within our business. At the minute, it's largely been around single-use plastics and the more obvious CO2 load. I think they are, certainly in our business, we recruit scientists and engineers, so they do understand issues like cost benefit and payback time. So they're not being daft about what they're asking the business to do. But I think the sustainability is at the front of their agenda. As a business, we've always looked at energy consumption and reviewed it as a bunch of directors, and we generally talk about it within the business. Increasingly, it's required to publish. So our annual report that got launched, well, actually is about to get launched for this year, has the CO2 figures in it. So I think we produce like 100 tons of CO2 from gas and 400 tons from electricity. But interestingly, 900 tons from transport, which is mostly air flights. So those kind of statistics are front and center of people's mind. Does it drive into our property strategy for the new building? Absolutely. I think, again, they're assuming that we are building to the highest standards in terms of the building, in terms of energy efficiency. That's just taken as read. I think the staff are focusing very much, perhaps less on the embodied CO2 in the building fabric, but more the ongoing costs, the energy efficiency, and the transport networks. So can they now cycle to and from work without using a vehicle is front and center of their mind, their personal contribution. Do they have to take that flight? Can they work from home? So part of the new building is about how we actually enable them to do that.
Okay, that's very useful, Sam. Matt, did you just want to share with us the response to that first question? That's quite interesting. Okay, that's useful. We'll come back to that in a short while. Sven, perhaps I could put a challenging question to you, if I may. As a developer that doesn't hold property, therefore doesn't operate the building, and therefore life cycle costings are less important, or how do I phrase this one correctly? Lower on your agenda than it would be for the tenants that come into your buildings. How do you look at the challenge of perhaps the additional cost of deploying these sustainability solutions with regard to the rental income that might come back in from a marketplace? Perhaps you give us some thought. You're on mute, by the way, Sven.
I think, look, the challenge that we have got as a development industry, and it needs to change, is that at the moment there is no real differential between a good building and a really outstanding building in terms of rental value. That is what has got to change, and that has got to be valued if that's going to drive it forward at a much faster rate. Will you let a more sustainable building quicker? Yes. Might the rent free be slightly less? Who knows? Those are the sorts of discussions that you start at the beginning of a job. I think, sort of picking up with some of the things Mike was saying, actually the planners and the politicians are driving the whole agenda very, very hard. So, the Cambridge Climate Change Charter, which the City Council are leading, which we as a business are likely to sign, it's basically saying, how do we make our businesses better and the things that we do better? Because ultimately, if you can do that, you can attract and best clients. But the challenge we have is that it doesn't generate a higher return. It's just the way, at the moment, the way the market works. Will that change over the next 2 or 3 years? I hope so.
Thanks, Sven. And so, how does when you are looking at your future funding options for your schemes, you're influenced by the tenant in one direction coming through and saying, I want this sort of level of accommodation, but also you're influenced by the institutional investor, and them telling you that they require a certain amount of sustainability? How much force is that?
That's sort of imposed. So, you know, the likes of, you know, the big institutional investors that we work with are really pushing, you know, L&G, for example, really pushing this agenda. They, you know, if we're going to work with them, it arrives in your inbox and it's bang, this is what we want you to work to. This is how, you know, how we want you to deliver the building, because ultimately they can see over a 5 to 10 year period, if you're not invested in the right stock, you're and A, it's socially it's not the right thing to do, but B, economically, you're not going to get such a good performance. So it's the two-pronged. It's the tenants pushing us, but at the moment not willing to pay. And at the other end, it's the capital saying, actually, we really want to do the right thing. We only want to invest with the right partners, with the right governance, who are going to have the right social impact, because they want to have the right social impact locally, and they've got the right environmental credentials. So, and that is, you know, more and more, you know, front and center with all of our partners.
And is the weight of the fund up greater than the weight of the tenant at this point in time?
At that point in time, at the beginning of the project, on a speculative job, the things that are weighing heavily are the planning policy, because Cambridge has adopted a climate change emergency approach. So they are, you know, really wanting us to stretch and do a good job, and that's political, and that's what we, you know, we want to appeal to the local community and the politicians. And then it's the finance that's coming in and saying, actually, we want to be best in class, we want you to push it. And then there's a balance. How do we make the numbers work? How do we push the specification within that cost envelope and within that rental profile? Can we put another £1 or £2 on the rent? Do you feel comfortable, fund, that we can do that? And that's where the decision on how far the sustainability goes versus the funding. But that's an open discussion that it wouldn't have been in years gone by.
Yeah, okay, that's useful. Mike, just turning back to the planning position a little bit. Prior to this session, you were outlining to us that the Greater London Authority is now putting a great deal more emphasis on sustainability and perhaps adjusting its planning policy, that will inevitably roll out to a regional focus as well. Perhaps you can just give us a bit more of an outline on what you're seeing.
Yeah, so the London Plan, the Emerging London Plan, has a whole life cycle carbon assessment requirement for all new buildings. So pretty soon in London, all commercial buildings will be subject to a whole life cycle carbon assessment. The key for me, though, Nick, is it's fine putting these obligations on, but I think Sven started to tease out the commercial realities of these, and I think if you have modern buildings and there are requirements, I think what planning policy isn't recognising is if you are giving a greater priority to that, something has to give. And what we haven't had is an honest discussion about the primacy of sustainability in the agenda, because it is just another part of the discussion at the moment. It is said to be prime, but it isn't. If you have a discussion with any planning authority at the moment, you'll start with the heritage, you'll start with the design. There is a whole raft of education as to what it really means to our cities. The response to the local plan, the issues and options in Cambridge, the overwhelming response is people want more dense cities, which is great. What comes with that? That's what planning policy is struggling to recognise at the moment, Nick, is there is a requirement that's being put on, which I think most investors and when the investors and the regulation is there, the tenants will have no choice and it'll be priced in. But it is becoming increasingly difficult in the planning world to navigate through what is really important, and has this been given the primacy that everyone says it has? At the moment, it hasn't. It is discussed, but it isn't given the primacy in planning policy that it should have.
Okay, useful, thank you. Max, as someone who is obviously responsible for responding to all tenant demands in the region, it would be useful just to understand from your side whether or not there is a high degree of sustainability requirement coming through from our tenants. My perception, and I might well be wrong, is that actually it's not as high on the agenda as it is within the planning policy or indeed the funding environment. But perhaps you could allude to what you've seen in the past and how that has changed over the last 18 months.
Yes, sure. I mean, 2019 saw sustainability front and centre on the corporate agenda, and that clearly feeds through to property decisions. And at last we were seeing sustainability kind of gain some teeth in those decision makings. For years, a base sustainability checklist was rolled out, at acquisition time, but invariably, in tight markets, newer buildings would meet those base levels required. And if an occupier only had second-hand stock available, the sustainability scoring matrix kind of could be swerved or missed out. I think now with corporates and government shouting and stating their sustainability credentials, we've seen actually a much more aspirational demand from them, from the occupiers, and an intense questioning of sustainability credentials, and they want best in class. It's been an interesting point, I think, to note that during this pause in market activity or slow pedalling that's been caused by C19, it's been used by occupiers at the larger and pre-let end of the market, perhaps to carry out some enhanced due diligence on the sustainability credentials of the buildings that they're considering. So they've used this time wisely in relation to sustainability. I mean, I think this, what we're seeing immediately with sustainability and the impact of C19, I think the three things. The first thing that occupiers are really focused on is just actually how are we actually going to the practicalities of reoccupying and reopening space. So where does that gone is the preoccupation of occupational densities and how how a building asset can be sweated for maximum occupation. It's no longer the planning grid, it's now the social distancing grid that occupiers are really trying to get their head around. Secondly, I suppose C19 is going to force organisational change at an unprecedented rate. All organisations, wherever they were on the agile working journey, it's been forcibly accelerated. And as we gradually return to the office, the operational state is going to need to have flex of reoccupation. Now, with home and office working locations now embedded, there's going to be actually the amount of office time that is actually people are going to have, it is going to be reduced, and this actually might elevate the importance of the time that people do spend within the office, because it's going to be where they do that collaboration and innovation work. So with office time becoming actually potentially more premium, organisations and their employees are going to continue, I think, to demand the quality and then therefore the sustainable type space that we've got to offer, or they'll demand. And thirdly, I think longer term, occupiers will want greater resilience from their stock due to from C19. They always want flexibility in their buildings and portfolio. And I think enhanced building sustainability standards will only add resilience to how they occupy spaces. And this is going to go beyond, I think, individual buildings, but also the sustainability credentials of the entire portfolios of those larger portfolios. Will it be now the single HQ versus a hub and spoke kind of type model, understanding the sustainability of different travel type models for their workforce? So I think it is very early to say kind of the impact of C19 on sustainability, but I think sustainability had reached the top of the table in terms of their selection process, and I think that isn't now going to dissipate quickly, and it will remain very, very important, and has at last, I think, since 2029, is now actually impactful on decision making.
Okay, thank you, Max. Sam, just returning back to you, as a provider that is perhaps not dissimilar to some other consultants, and you will have your clients looking at you and how you behave. How much of an influence are they on your sustainability credentials and what you're delivering, and how much impact does that have on what you're doing within your choice of your building design?
That's an interesting question. I think currently, while some of the bigger corporates tend to try to flow down their decisions on sustainability to their supply base. We're not seeing it from the typical customers that we take on and the typical kind of projects. So while you might get flow downs in terms of modern slavery policy or bribery policy, and you might get flow down, we definitely get flow down on GDPR. We're not seeing a flow down in terms of requirements in terms of sustainability. There are certainly travel policy decisions that are made by our clients, and those do get imposed. Frankly, I think our policies are probably already more sustainable than theirs anyway. So I think we're not seeing it at the moment. I would suspect that in the future we will see some of it. I think in some companies such as Unilever, for example, are in the FMCG space, are putting pressure on their supply base. If you look at what they're requesting in terms of packaging suppliers to them, they're requiring them to reduce the amount of packaging. We know of one cardboard manufacturer who's been asked to halve the size of the thickness of the cardboard, but to retain the rigidity and protective nature of it. So that's forcing their supply base to be more inventive. So I think it's kind of thing that's going to happen. Will it affect the business and the space? I don't think so. They might be requiring us to report on it at some stage, but it's hard to then suddenly change the building that you occupy or the travel that you do as a business. So for them to impose something on us would be a problem. They might end up benchmarking you as a supplier to them. They might try to understand how high on their list you should be. So that is a factor that we might consider in the future. I wouldn't say it's a really high one at the moment. Okay,
that's great. And Max, just looking back at one of the other questions I probably should have posed to you there, is about that cost in operation that Mike talked about, the whole life cycle carbon costing. Does that ever feature in some of the tenants coming to you and asking you about the buildings that you're showing them? Did you catch that, Max?
Sorry, break up. Yeah, but Max,
we're losing you. We're losing you.
Yeah, no.
We'll come back to you in a minute. We'll give your internet a chance to recover its position. Sven, just dropping back to you, Sven, looking at the future. How worried are you that with the impact of COVID and the fact that we're all sitting at home working, that suddenly there'll be a less of a demand for the office requirements, and particularly in your sector, because obviously that's what you're intrinsically looking at providing. You're on mute again, Sven.
I would say this, wouldn't I? But inherently we are social creatures, and I don't know what everyone else's experience of working at home. I think as part of the toolkit, I think it's a very good addition, and I think it is here to stay. But I think in terms of the coming together and the type of space and the collaboration and sort of well-being, because I think that's the other thing that we sort of haven't really focused on in terms of occupiers. The mental well-being and sort of wellness. I could see that offices will be have a lot more facilities. It's starting from the point of arrival, whether it's gyms or whether it's, so I can see that the whole sort of looking after your staff, because, it is isolating working at home, and those chance encounters and discussions don't happen so frequently, and it is quite difficult to move when you're collaborating across a large number of people and you are moving things forward very quickly, it's quite slow. Yeah. When you are remote, you are working at 60-70% speed, whereas if you're in the same room, you are moving much quicker, and everyone has, at that point, you'd hope, an equal voice, rather than the managing director saying, we've got to do it this way, this is the way we're doing it. You know, those subtleties of body language and letting everyone have their say, I think, are really important on a face-to-face. So long, short, it's going to be different. It's going to be less dense. It's going to be different usage. It's going to be, you know, some home working, some collaboration. But I think, and we've said this many times before as an industry, the office is dead. You know, we've 2 or 3 times over the last 20 years. And it has sort of come back stronger and different. Yeah. And I think the same will apply when we come out of COVID in the next 2 or 3 years.
I think you're right. I think one of the reservations that that we see as a business is that sustainability is a fundamentally important part of our operation, and is being driven by the younger generation more so than ourselves. But our ability to coach and hone our younger generation as they develop their thinking around the operational needs for our business and for working with clients can't be there, because that face-to-face interaction can't happen quite on the same level and scale as it can do if you're sat in a group of people. And therefore, if we can't maintain a socially isolated working environment for a long period, as it will not develop the individuals that we need for the future. Even though it is a very sustainable board. Yeah, my fuel bill has disappeared, and therefore my carbon footprint has disappeared because of sitting at home. But I don't think that's a long-term option either. Good. Thank you. We have the opportunity, I think, to open the floor up a bit now to questions. And I think, Matt, you're just going to host the sort of posing of questions and positioning of questions to the team, if that's possible.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. So the first question we've got up here is asking about the cost implications of the Part L building regs on build cost and also land value. And there's also a kind of follow-on question to that, which is really talking about, actually, are we seeing a differential in value of buildings that are more sustainable? And I guess they're kind of linked. Sven, do you want to sort of talk about that from your perspective, as a developer? Yeah. So, you know, look, Part L is embedded in what we do. Land values on speculative developments, even in somewhere as strong as Cambridge, are very low. So, you know, development for a speculative development is marginal. You know, a spec yield at 6 and 6.25% based off today's rents is a real challenge to deliver on what all of the stakeholders want, and we as a business want as well. So, you know, at that point, when all the planets aligned, you've got the right scheme, you've got the right specification, that's a eureka moment, and you've got a land value, a positive land value, that's a good start. But yes, land value, unless it's a pre-let, and of course a pre-let discussion is a completely different, but on a speculative development, land values are impacted heavily by the by the regs and by the sustainability agenda. Great, thanks, Sven. Max, just wondering from your perspective, the clients you're speaking to, that point about value, is that coming through in the clients you're speaking to? Are people willing to pay more for a sustainable building? You're on mute, Max.
I think they will be prepared to pay more. The shortage of spaces in a city like Cambridge, they haven't actually had the choices of necessarily having a higher sustainable versus less sustainable option to actually therefore put that price differential in. Yeah, it'll be interesting if C19 starts releasing some second-hand space, that we might well see actually the Grade B pricing fall away quickly, we will see occupiers wanting to go to that higher level, and therefore you'll see the prime rents remain and continue to grow, whereas we'll see that large jumps that we've seen in second-hand spaces actually begin to fall away first if there is a weakening of the market output of C19. So I think there will be a preparedness to pay a premium for the greener buildings.
Great, thanks, Max. Mike, I'm going to come to you this next one. It's a new question just in, talking about are we likely to see a move of occupiers out of city centres, i.e. away from congested public transport? I know this is an area you've been looking into last year in quite some detail. So what's your thoughts now, given the impact of COVID-19? Because I think it might have maybe changed slightly.
Well, was it the head of Barclays Bank was questioning whether or not he needed 7,000 people in one building in central London. The question of building densities, the question of the facilities that Sven talked about, the question of access to car parking, and the popularity or the attraction of public transport is questioned. But I think Sven's point is it's a short term. It is significant and it is material in our lives for a couple of years, but in the grand scheme of things, what is the effect in that long run? Investment decisions aren't going to be made, and my narrative was deliberate, and that we looked at the discussion before Christmas, we looked at the months leading up to the crisis, we looked at April, we looked at May and June, and in those 4 different narratives, you got 4 slightly different emphases and 4 different focuses. So I think it's quite dangerous to say there's going to be a fundamental change in the way that things operate. I think people are enjoying. I think the acceleration of the digital engagement has been fantastic. But how short-lived is it? So there will be a push because people now understand that there's an alternative. But we're looking at some sites with some landowners, and the wellbeing agenda, the ability to get out of your office, walk in green space, the ability to socially distance probably will become important. But is it going to be important in 5 years' time as it is in the next 2 years? That's the question.
Thanks, Mike. And just following on from that, really, I'll go to Sam and Sven quickly for their response on this. And I guess it's really sort of thinking about that, what Mike's been talking about, and how people are perhaps enjoying, living in a different way and reducing their sustainable impact. Are you seeing that coming through in terms of what you think your occupier demands will be? Either you as an occupier, Sam, or you as a developer, Sven, in terms of what that demand will be, and will people be wanting to be more at home going forward? Is that something you're going to factor in your planning? So let's go to Sam first.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think we really quite know how mindsets have been changed yet. We've had a great experiment as a company that focuses on getting more people onto one site so we can get those opportunistic overlaps, because that's where our business value comes from. We've always pushed to get more people on site and resisted too much home working. So we've had this forced experiment over the past 12 weeks. And we're going to pull back from it, and we're going to get more people on site, and we're going to see what resistance we get at that point. So I think the reality is probably certainly over the next 12 months we're going with a mixed model with more home working, and we will find out more how that works, and we will find out how the mindsets have changed. We're currently running a few surveys of staff to try and understand what works, what doesn't work in this experiment. I would say that already we were focusing on things like how we make a better space in the new building. We were already focusing on how it was a low occupation because we were not pressurizing the people per square meter. We were already focusing on a lot of open spaces, focusing on high quality air anyway, because for us the extra cost of doing that is small compared to the revenue per person. So I don't think it's going to change that, but I do suspect that home working will become more of a thing for us as we go forward.
Thanks. And Sven, would you like to pick up on that point as well?
I think one of the trends of the last 10 years has been more and more people into the same space. So we've seen a drive from 1 to 12, 1 to 10, 1 to 8, 1 to 6. So it's been all about you know, trying to manage the cost overhead by putting more and more people into the space. Put more and more people into the space. The buildings have been, you know, requiring more air, bigger fire escapes, you know, more loos, more shower facilities, you know, and I think that sort of resilience is probably here to stay. But I think certainly the occupiers that we're talking to are not wanting to occupy at those densities anymore. So they're sort of thinking, you know, 1 to 12, and so I think we'll see offices becoming less dense, and the capacity being taken up by home working. But that's sort of it's a trend that's only just emerging in these discussions that we're having with occupiers now.
Great.
Would you agree with that, Max?
You're on mute, Max.
Absolutely, I agree completely. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Sven. Just one quick question. I know we're kind of close on time now, so just a quick question. I'll actually ask each of the panelists to respond very quickly on this, which follows on from what Sven was just talking about there. And a question will come in. Could you describe your perfect office post-COVID-19, what it looked like, what has changed? If we can just do it very quickly, just a few words. We'll start off with Mike, and then we'll go around the panel. So Mike, perfect office post-COVID-19, what will it look like and what has changed?
I'll take the room that I'm in now and put it in an office so I can walk out the door and actually talk to someone meaningful. So the view that I've got, Matt, the view that I've got, the music that I've got, the comfort that I've got, but I open the door and it's by magic. I'm talking to Sven, I'm talking to Sam, I'm talking to Nick. So I've got it already. I just need a 3D printer to move it to the to somewhere else.
Brilliant, thanks, Mike. Let's go to you, Sam.
So having just got to the completion of the design for the building we're about to build, we have looked at it and discussed whether it's COVID compatible. And actually, I think because it's low occupation, because it's got multiple corridors and multiple ingress and exit, because it's got high quality air, it's single story, there is no lifts. Actually, I think it is pretty much the perfect building. The only thing we'll probably change is there'll be more automation in terms of the entrance and exits, and also probably more distributed communal areas rather than the big canteen and big coffee centres. That's the thing we'll probably end up changing.
Right, so almost perfection there. Sue, what's your thoughts on that one?
It's probably pretty similar to Bidwell House, to be honest. Maybe for me, less for commute, but so yeah, Bidwell House here would be nice.
Nick, what about your thoughts on this one?
Well, I love the idea of actually not having to travel as much to go to some of the sites. I think we wasted a great deal of time actually in transport mode, albeit that I do love the social interaction and understanding people's businesses. So if there was some way of us evolving the teleportation of me to a client's site at some point in time, then that will be the ideal world for us to improve our sustainability. Buildings for me are places that people should enjoy, and the spaces within them should be a pleasure to work in, and perhaps a slightly less density than we have now will facilitate that. But that's I don't think that's a pipe dream apart from the teleportation. But we can certainly get to an optimal solution fairly quickly, I think, in the evolution of building design.
Great, Max, what's your view on that one?
Well, we want them let, we want them occupied, and I think they've got to be occupied in an agile way. That the office has got to become a destination, where we do our innovation and collaboration piece rather than necessarily just working. We're going to have many places where we work, but that's what they've got to be moving forward.
Right, and then the final word on this one to Sven before we pass back to Nick to close off proceedings. So Sven, over to you.
No, I think making wellness as part of the whole office agenda. I mean, one of the things I've enjoyed is the fact I'm not having crummy sandwiches every day, and the fact that exercise and movement and nature are all sort of part of our life, which I think somehow if we can embed that in our offices to make it a happier place where people are healthier, that would be what I would be striving towards.
Great, thanks, Tim. I think it's been fascinating having this conversation. I think what's come out of it for me is that it's clear that the political agenda and the public or staff's agenda are paramount in terms of trying to drive sustainability. From a corporate level, I'm not sure that we have really got to grips with what sustainability will mean for us and how we actually drive it through our businesses of the future. I think there's a lot of work for us to do there, and the sustainability approach that we're being forced into doing is one that we just have to take and get on with it and make it a successful world for our children in the future. So thank you to all our delegates today for taking part. Fascinating insight into all your different parts of the business. Really appreciate you spending the time to come and talk to us. Just by way of a future notification, we have another seminar coming up on the 10th of June, which is the exploration of the unique ecosystems of knowledge-intensive companies in the Golden Triangle. I'm sure someone will explain to you what all that means, but there is a session coming up on the 10th of June, and you will all get an invite to that one very shortly as a delegate that attended this meeting. So thank you for all your time today. Really appreciate it. I hope you found it enjoyable, and we look forward to hosting you in due course. Many thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.